You're not tired. You're fighting a war and you don't even realize it. And the scariest part, it's not a war against the world, not against other people. It's a war inside you. Before I show you where this war begins, do something for me real quick. Tell me in the comments where you're watching from, what city and country. Sometimes this fight can feel lonely, and I want you to see how many people are here with you. It doesn't show up in photos. It doesn't make noise. It doesn't leave bruises on your body, but it steals your energy. It sours you from the inside. It makes you irritable for no reason, and it turns you into someone you barely recognize. You try to be better. You try to control yourself. You try to do everything right. And still, it feels like it gets worse. Do you know why? Because there's a trio working in silence. Guilt, control, and resentment. They form a perfect army. One accuses you, one squeezes you, and the third poisons you. Today I'm going to show you how this war works, and what changes the moment you finally look the enemy in the face. And here comes the uncomfortable jab. Maybe you're not pursuing growth. Maybe you're just punishing yourself with discipline and calling it virtue. Stay with me, because at the end I'm going to connect this to a truth from Friedrich Nietzsche that's uncomfortable but freeing. And once you understand it, the war loses its disguise. Pay attention to one detail. This war doesn't look like a war. It looks like responsibility. It looks like maturity. It looks like high standards. It looks like you saying, I just want to be a better person. But your body tells the truth. When this war is active, you feel a tightness in your chest when you rest, a strange irritation when someone is happy without apologizing, a quiet anxiety when you're not producing, and a kind of exhaustion that sleep doesn't fix. Because it's not a lack of energy, it's energy being burned in internal combat. And here's the simplest test in the world. If you have to torture yourself to function, that's not growth. That's survival disguised as discipline. And I'm going to prove it with 3 scenes that seem small, but sit at the center of the whole problem. When you hear them, you'll recognize them immediately. Let's start with a simple question. When did living turn into a courtroom? You do something good and you don't celebrate. You rest and you feel guilty. You say no and you feel like the villain. You try to please and you feel empty. You try to stand your ground and you're afraid of losing love. Do you see it? Your mind isn't functioning like a home. It's functioning like a surveillance system. And that surveillance system shows up in small moments. Like this. You finish a task and you don't feel relief. You feel, okay, now what? Because your mind doesn't register victory. It only registers the next risk. You receive a compliment and you immediately think, they don't know who I really am. And instead of joy, fear shows up. What if I disappoint them? You catch yourself rehearsing conversations in your head, repeating arguments, imagining how people will react, not because you're strategic, but because you're trying to avoid social pain. And maybe the cruelest part, you become great at noticing other people's flaws and terrible at recognizing your own dignity. That's training, emotional training. You are trained to associate love with performance, respect with perfection, peace with control. So living becomes a test and you become a student who never passes because the test never ends. And this is the first big key. There's a part of you that doesn't want you at peace. It wants you acceptable. Acceptable to what? To the image you learned would earn love, to the image that avoids rejection, to the image that protects you from criticism. But that comes at a cost, because when you live to be accepted, you start treating your own soul like a defective project. I have to improve. I have to fix this. I have to stop that. I have to be stronger. I have to handle everything. And the more you say I have to, the more you become an obedient soldier, fighting for a cause you never chose. Now pay attention. This war has a strategy. It starts with guilt. Guilt isn't just a feeling. Guilt is a mental technology. It works like this. It takes your human need to belong and turns it into a leash. When you feel guilty, you're not just sad. You're submissive. You want to make up for it. You want to justify yourself. You want to prove you still deserve to be there. And that's why guilt is used so much by people, by groups, by family patterns, by ideologies, and even by you. Guilt keeps you small and useful. Think about it. How many times did you do something out of love? And how many times did you do it just to avoid being blamed? Because guilt has a trick. It disguises itself as conscience. But there's a massive difference between conscience and guilt. Conscience guides you. That doesn't match who you want to be. Guilt humiliates you. You're bad. You don't deserve. Conscience helps you grow. Guilt makes you bow. And when you keep bowing, you start accumulating a quiet rage. But you don't call it rage, you call it tiredness. But it's not tiredness, it's resentment fermenting. Now here's an important point. There are two types of guilt. Healthy guilt is rare and specific. It says, I hurt someone, I need to repair. It has a beginning, a middle, and an end. Toxic guilt isn't about an error. It's about existing. You feel guilty for resting, guilty for saying no, guilty for not being available, guilty for wanting something different, guilty for changing. And that toxic guilt usually comes from one very specific place, an environment where you learned that love was conditional. Sometimes it was family, sometimes religion, sometimes school, sometimes a relationship where you had to shrink just to not lose it. So you grow up with an invisible sentence on your forehead. I have to earn it. And I have to earn it becomes a lifestyle. You start apologizing for your space, apologizing for your opinion, apologizing for your presence. And the saddest part is that when you live this way, you don't realize you're being controlled. Because you call it being a good person. But let me give you a very common scene. You're exhausted. You don't want to go, you don't want to reply, you don't want to help. But you go, you reply, you help. And later you feel anger. Only you don't say, I'm angry. You say, I'm just tired. Guilt pushes you forward and resentment charges you interest. And to avoid feeling guilt, you switch on control mode. And that's the second soldier in this war, control. There's a type of person who learn to survive like this, by controlling everything. They control how they speak. They control their expression. They control what they feel. They control what they want. They control what they show. They control what they need. And on the outside, it looks like maturity. On the outside, it looks like strength. But on the inside, a lot of the time, it's just fear. Fear of being judged. Fear of losing respect. Fear of looking weak. Fear of being abandoned. So you become a strict manager of yourself. But too much control doesn't bring peace, it brings chronic tension. And excessive control is almost always a well-behaved form of trauma, because it doesn't show up as chaos. It shows up as, I fixed myself. But the symptoms give it away. You relax and you feel unsafe, you have fun, and then you feel guilty. You struggle to feel pleasure without justifying it. You want guarantees before you live. And I'll tell you a mini story that's more common than it looks. Someone learns early that emotion gets punished. If you cry, you're weak. If you complain, you're ungrateful. If you ask, you're needy. If you make a mistake, you get attacked. So they develop a skill, not being a burden. They become predictable, praised, too mature for their age. But behind that is a child saying, if I'm perfect, nobody can hurt me. The problem is the brain doesn't know how to stop. It keeps trying to avoid danger, even when the danger is gone. So you become an adult who can't be spontaneous without feeling threatened. You control yourself so you won't suffer, but control becomes the suffering. And when that control fails, because it always fails, a terrible feeling shows up. I can't do this anymore. And that's when resentment enters like slow poison. Do you know why? Because you're always one step behind yourself, trying to prevent yourself from being human. So you don't live, you manage, you don't feel, you calculate, you don't choose, you avoid. And when someone lives like this for too long, something inevitable happens. A part of you starts to hate this control. And that's where resentment is born. And no, resentment isn't just anger. Resentment is anger that learned to live in silence. It's anger that can't leave through the front door, so it escapes through a window as cynicism. Resentment is dangerous because it's clever. It rarely says, I'm angry. It says, I'm just being realistic. It says, I just can't stand fake people. It says, I'm just tired of carrying the world on my back. And yes, sometimes you really did carry too much, but the question that cuts is this. Why did you carry it? Out of love or out of fear, out of generosity or to avoid conflict? Because when you do good as a form of escape, goodness becomes a prison. And every prison creates the desire for revenge. Only this revenge doesn't show up as a fist on the table. It shows up as sabotage, as coldness, as sarcasm, as delay, as lack of energy, as I forgot, as I couldn't. Resentment is when you don't let yourself say no, but you also don't let yourself say yes for real. So you start living half present, half body, half soul. And that creates a horrible inner state. You feel trapped, and you still feel guilty for being trapped. Let's make resentment visible. It shows up when you start thinking things like, No one does for me what I do for others. I always give more. People are ungrateful. No one understands me. I can't rely on anyone. And it might be true, but the forbidden question is the real one. Do you give because you chose to, or because you can't say no? Because when you can't say no, you become a hostage to your own yes. And that yes becomes emotional debt. And emotional debt always turns into collection. Sometimes you collect with passive-aggressive comments, sometimes with coldness. Sometimes by disappearing without explaining. Sometimes by making people pay with guilt, the same way you live under guilt. Resentment is what happens when you lose the courage to assert yourself and try to regain power by punishing the world in silence. And then you notice something scary. Resentment starts to feel like an identity. You get used to living in distrust mode, in nobody's worth it mode, in I already know how this ends mode. But that isn't wisdom, that's a wound running your life. And now, here comes the real jab. Resentment often grows when you live as if you're morally obligated to be what other people expect. And that's where Friedrich Nietzsche comes in like a blade. Nietzsche was obsessed with this idea. Most people don't create their own values, they react. They don't say yes to life. They say no to other people's lives and call it virtue. They transform powerlessness into moral superiority. And that's resentment in its classic form. When you can't affirm your strength, you try to control the narrative. You trade power for judgment. And you become a tired judge, sitting in an inner courtroom condemning everyone, especially yourself. Let's draw the cycle clearly. First, you feel guilt. You think you're wrong for wanting something, for resting, for setting a boundary, for not pleasing. Then, you increase control. You try to correct yourself, watch yourself, edit yourself. You try to be better. Then you accumulate resentment, because control hurts, because living for expectations kills you from the inside, and you start feeling anger, but you won't admit it. Then resentment makes you sabotage, and sabotage creates more guilt. And just like that, the war gets fed. Do you see the trick? This war is a machine that fuels itself. And as long as you think the problem is lack of motivation, you'll treat yourself with a whip. But maybe the problem is something else. You're trying to cure existential exhaustion with productivity. You're trying to cure lack of meaning with discipline. You're trying to cure emotional wounds with self-control. And it doesn't work, because you don't need more force. You need more truth. Most people ask, how do I stop feeling this? And that question already turns you into your own enemy. Swap it for this. What inside me is trying to protect me? Guilt is usually protecting belonging. Control is usually protecting safety. Resentment is usually protecting wounded dignity. So under the war, there's an attempt at protection, but it's protection that became tyranny. So the solution isn't to kill these parts. The solution is to take their power away. And here's a simple exercise that works incredibly well when you're listening. Answer this in your head. In what area of life do you feel the most guilt right now? Work, family, relationships, your body, money? What control do you use to avoid feeling that guilt? Perfectionism? People-pleasing? Avoidance? Staying quiet? Overworking? Punishing yourself? And how does resentment show up? Tiredness? Cynicism? Irritation? Coldness? Lack of motivation? Procrastination? If you answered, congratulations. You just located the battlefield. Now that you've located the battlefield, I want to give you a simple protocol. It's not magic, it's method. First, pause for 3 seconds. When guilt or control shows up, stop and breathe. No explanations, no justifications, just a pause. Second, name it. Say in your mind, this is guilt, this is control, this is resentment. Naming reduces power because it turns a monster into a mechanism. Third, negotiate. Ask, what is this trying to protect? Guilt says, I want belonging. Control says, I want safety. Resentment says, I want dignity. You don't fight the intention, you correct the method. Fourth, choose a small action, but a real one. Not becoming a new person. A minimal act of sovereignty. If it's guilt about resting, rest for 10 minutes without justifying it. If it's control, do it good enough and stop. If it's resentment, tell a short truth without aggression. I can't. I don't want to. I need time. I'll do it, but not today. It sounds small, but it's huge, because it cuts the cycle at the root. You stop reacting automatically. And then you step into what I call the rarest kind of courage, the courage to disappoint expectations so you don't betray yourself. And now comes the part that changes everything: boundaries. Guilt hates boundaries because a boundary says I exist. And a lot of people were trained to believe that existing too much is selfish. So when you set a boundary, you feel guilt. That's normal. But the boundary is the medicine, because it interrupts the cycle. If you don't set boundaries, you control everything so you won't disappoint. If you control everything, you build resentment. If you build resentment, you sabotage. If you sabotage, you feel guilt. A boundary cuts the circuit. And it's not an aggressive boundary, it's a clear boundary. A boundary isn't, I'm going to humiliate you. A boundary is, I'm not going to betray myself. Now, setting boundaries without aggression is an art. And you need ready-made lines, because in the moment of a trigger, your mind goes back to the old mode. Here are a few short lines that work. I can't take that on right now. I hear you, but I'm not going to do that. I need to think, and I'll get back to you. I can help up to this point. I won't accept being treated like that. I'd rather do it another way. It's not personal. It's my boundary. And notice what happens when you set a boundary. Guilt screams. It tries to convince you that you're being selfish. But in practice, boundaries are emotional hygiene. Like brushing your teeth. You're not attacking anyone. You're preventing your life from rotting on the inside. And here's the irony. A lot of people only respect you after you stop trying to be loved. Because too much people-pleasing sends an invisible message. You can step over me. A boundary sends a different one. You can't. And that reduces resentment because you stop feeling like a hostage. And that single sentence is almost Nietzsche in spirit because it's an inner yes. And Nietzsche had an idea that fits perfectly here. A healthy life isn't a life without pain. It's a life with the power to affirm, choose, and sustain. You don't need to be perfect. You need to be responsible for yourself. Now let's close with the dark truth we promised. Nietzsche hit one point again and again. When you live dominated by guilt and by a morality of submission, you start calling weakness a virtue. You start taking pride in what reduces you. You start thinking it's noble to sacrifice yourself until you hate yourself. You start praising everything that domesticates you. So the war within you isn't an accident. It becomes a lifestyle. And now, why does this have anything to do with Nietzsche? Because Nietzsche wasn't trying to make you comfortable. He was trying to make you alive. He looked at the human being and saw a massive danger, turning pain into morality and turning weakness into virtue. When someone can't affirm their own will, they start living reactively. They don't create values. They react to other people's values. They don't say, I want, they say, I hate what they want. And then they call that hate justice, purity, maturity. That's resentment elevated into a philosophy of life. And the dark part is that it looks noble. It looks altruistic. It looks like being a good person. But underneath, it's just a life that can't say yes to itself. Nietzsche would call it a domesticated spirit, a spirit that asks permission to exist. And now the line that ties it all together. The dark truth is this. A lot of people aren't pursuing growth. They're pursuing an elegant way to punish themselves. And as long as you punish yourself, you'll think you deserve less. You'll tolerate more. You'll accept crumbs. You'll swallow disrespect. You'll live in silence. And resentment grows and you become the kind of person who criticizes everything because you lost the ability to create. Nietzsche would call that a reactive life. A life that doesn't affirm, it only responds. So here's the turn. The war ends when you stop reacting and start choosing. Choosing what you sustain. Choosing what you refuse. Choosing who you want to be without apologizing for existing. If you understood this video, you're going to notice the war in real time. You'll notice guilt trying to bend you, control trying to squeeze you, resentment trying to poison you, and instead of hating yourself for feeling it, you'll do something stronger. You'll see it. And seeing is already half of freedom. Because the hidden war depends on darkness. It grows where you refuse to look. So tell me, which of these three enemies is strongest in you right now? Guilt, control, or resentment? And if you want part 2, where I show you how to turn this energy into real strength, without cheap motivational talk and without dry philosophy, subscribe and leave I see the war in the comments. You don't need to defeat the world, you need to stop losing to yourself. If you want to take this to the full 25 minutes, add this in your mind. You rest and feel guilty. You can't celebrate wins. You criticize yourself like an enemy. You get irritated by small things. You feel a secret pleasure in judging. You feel empty even when you do everything right. You delay decisions so you won't disappoint anyone. You feel like life became an obligation. Which of these signs do you recognize the most?